afternoon, everybody. We welcome you to this interesting conversation we are going to have today with the most popular weekly columnist on mapping the Indian states, and that's Dr. Chopra for you. And we are also joined in this conversation by Gauri Joshi, a budding writer and editor who's also the coordinator for the history faculty at Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. And we really look forward to listening to Dr. Chopra's views on why he has initiated the maps project. So what was the motivation, Dr. Chopra, to pick up maps among other symbols of sovereign authority? Why just maps and not stamps or any other medium that we chose to work upon? So what makes you, if I can put it very simply, fall in love with the maps project, and present this side of the history of the Indian states and the Indian Union?
Thank you, Monika, and it's a pleasure to be in conversation with both of you because you're both heavily invested in history. Now, you see, the thought about writing about India has always been there in my mind, and I've always wondered why regional leaders in our country never got the importance which they got. And most of our history has been so Delhi-centric. It's always focused on sultans and kings and governor generals and prime ministers, and we have not really given much importance to those who were there in different regions of the country, different parts of the country. And then you remember that the preamble says that India, we the people of India have created the Republic of India. That's what it says. And then Article 1, 2, and 3. They talk about the territories of India. And therefore, if you look at the preamble and if you look at the articles, or in the first 3 articles in the Indian Constitution, it is also very clear that the territory of India has been defined. So how that territory of India and how the internal reorganization takes place, all this is very clearly defined in the Article 1, 2, and 3. So this is something which has been very interesting. Also the fact that, sometimes, a state is named in a particular manner, then the name changes. So this is what set me on looking at the various maps of India. And one more thing, you see, I had gone to Survey of India in February this year, where I started looking at the maps of India, and I realized that there is just no commonality between the map of India, the internal map of India in 1947, and the map of India as we see it today. So while the external territory of India are sacrosanct, the internal boundaries of India have been changed every 3, 4, 5 years. So this set me thinking on why should I not start looking at the maps of India. That's how it started, and then it was a fascinating subject, and I started writing. 2 or 3 columns I wrote, and then it became a regular feature, and now it's become so much intrinsic to my life. I like reading about the different states, and then you get a lot of dots get connected. So that's how the project actually took off.
Dr. Chopra, to take off from what you started with on your project, India has a federal state setup, and one would think that the sheer diversity that informs the culture and the politics of each state would be enough to destabilize our state setup. Instead, what we have most of the time is a very fine balance of state autonomy and national cohesion. What do you think could be the reasons for this?
You see, I think the reason for that, we have to go back. The fact that India is linguistically very diverse, this became a principle of the freedom movement in this country. Because as we are all aware, that till 1947, the Congress was the sort of the movement for freedom in this country. And as you are all aware, both of you are history students, that right from 1920s, the Congress had accepted the principle of linguistic reorganization of states. Therefore, what the Congress had inherited, or what India had inherited, was a system where the British provinces existed, and the British provinces existed for the administrative convenience of the British Raj. It did not exist to meet the democratic aspirations of the people. And there was the very first agitation was in Hyderabad, for example, where the Telugu-speaking region and the Maratha-speaking region so this is how it started. It started coming out. So this is how it started, and the fact that the political leadership in this country was willing to accept the ethnic aspirations of the people, the linguistic aspirations of the people, as long as it did not contradict the larger element of being part of Bharat. These aspirations were accepted, and these aspirations had actually been first. Should one say that they had been encouraged by the Congress. Before independence, the Congress had, for example, the Sindh Congress, it had the Utkal Congress, it had the Bombay Congress, it had the Gujarat Congress, it had the so in fact in the case of this entire Bombay region, you had three Congresses. You had the Congress for the state of Bombay, the city state of Bombay, you had the Maharashtra Congress, and you had the Gujarat Congress. So it was in a way it was always accepted that yes, you can ask for your linguistic rights and you can seek greater autonomy for states within the Indian Union. There is no problem. And that's given very clearly in the Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution.
It's interesting that you mentioned acceptance of diversity as something that worked for India. But our neighboring states, for instance, Pakistan, have very little diversity compared to us, and they have more unrest. So how do you think this would be explained? Because normally...
No, I think it's not true to say that Pakistan does not have diversity. It's just that the diversity has been brushed under the carpet. You see, Punjab, Sindh, the northwest frontier, Pakistan, Gilgit, Jammu, Kashmir area. All these are very distinct areas within Pakistan, but Pakistan has never accepted that diversity. You see, one of the things is that there is something known as the foundational principle of a state. The foundational principle in the neighboring state was Islam. So when Islam became the foundational principle of Pakistan, it brushed all other identities apart. And Pakistan could not have, the nature of the state of Pakistan could not have allowed diversity to take the role which diversity has been able to take in India. For instance, here we find no contradiction between being a good Punjabi or being a good Bengali or being a good Kannada or being a good Marathi. It doesn't matter, because the foundational root of this republic is the people of India and the states of India. And frankly, right from the times of when India was looked at upon as Bharatvarsha or as Hindustan, all these provinces, all these subas, all this has already existed, has always existed. And if you go back even to the times of Jambudweep, which I'm very fond of giving the example. So Bharatvarsha was a part of Jambudweep. And I would say that all the kingdoms which were spoken of by Sanjay in Sanjay Uvach, the very first stanzas of Mahabharata, and all that is part of the sacred geography of the country, also the political geography of the country. So you had the Kosal kingdom, and you had the Magads, and you had all these things. So India has always lived with a very diverse set of cultures, a very diverse set of languages. So it's not a contradiction. And in fact, the other thing which happened was that, unlike India, where political parties had to contest for coming to power and to get legitimacy, right? Which meant that, all parties, whether it is the Congress or the BJP or the CPM or any party, except for the regional parties, the parties which are based only on region, but let's say the national parties, they've all had to concede, or one can use the word concede, or one can use the word accept the linguistic aspiration. Whereas in Pakistan, Ayub Khan and the others, when they took over power, it was just a military fiat. He said one state, one unit. In fact, Pakistan's problem was that it had one unit, so it sort of wanted to make Punjab and Sindh and Balochistan and NFWP into one province. So it's not that diversity did not exist. It's that diversity was not accepted. And the non-acceptance of diversity, I think, has been a problem for democracy in Pakistan. History is full of counterfactuals, but can you imagine a different kind of Pakistan where Punjab and Sindh and Balochistan and Northwest Frontier Province could have also had their own thing? And if even now, there's always a fight between, if the Sharif family moves into power, then there's opposition from the Bhuttos. Now the Imran Khan is treated almost like an outsider. But I think we're discussing more about our neighbors. We should come back to our own state formation.
So, since you mentioned the importance of respecting diversity and how it has played a role in maps. I would like to say Benedict Anderson in his book has described nations as imagined communities. Now, when a nation is imagined, what is it imagined as? Maps play a very important role. So you see maps making as a project being driven by the politics, or do you think the way the map itself is will determine the politics that the country is to have? So which way do you think the tide of the history works?
No, I don't think there is a we can look at it in this paradigm, because both things are connected. I mean, some nations are imagined, but some nations are not imagined. For instance, the Bharatvarsha that we know, the territory of India, for example, is a defined territory. It is a made territory. Nobody can say that this territory always existed. But the concept of Bharata, the concept of Bharatvarsha as a part of Jambudweep, now this has always been there. Right. So this is not an imagined thing, because this is there in the Mahabharata, this is there in the Ramayana. If you see if you look at all the travels of Ram, if you look at all the armies of Mahabharata, so there is definitely, it's not an imagined thing. Even if it is imagined, it was imagined so long ago. It was imagined so long ago that now that imagination is very much a part of a mental construct. Now, having said that, certainly, whether Jessore is in India or in Pakistan, whether Murshidabad moved here or moved there, this is a part of the construct of history. So Radcliffe line is also true, and the larger concept of Bharatvarsha is also true. So somewhere along the line, I don't think we have to be dogmatic about it. And Benedict does make a point, but it makes a point only up to a point. I think that's not the whole truth. So I will not go completely with Anderson. I would say that yes, there is a point and a lot of states are very artificial states, like what Europe did to Africa. Now, that certainly was something which was not organic, which did not grow from within. So I think we have to use Benedict Anderson also in the particular contexts when we talk about nation building and nation states.
Dr. Chopra, you mentioned at various fora that until 1954, to the north of India, the maps of India would always say Tibet. And in 1954, this became China. Would you say that if Lal Bahadur Shastri had been Prime Minister then instead of Jawaharlal Nehru, things would have been any different?
Well, you see, this is of course a very we cannot really reimagine history, but certainly one thing was there, that there was a big debate between Sardar Patel and Pandit Nehru on the issue of how India should look at China, and because of the obsession, or one should say because of the romance which the first Prime Minister had towards socialist planning, towards centralized state system, perhaps. That was one view, and Sardar Patel's view was quite different. So I don't know what would have happened, but certainly it may not have been the obsession with centralized planning and with socialism, which Mr. Nehru had, that may not have been the same. Would not have had the same salience in the political processes had somebody else been the Prime Minister of this country. You see, and also one thing that we got to understand is that Mr. Nehru was looking at India from the lens of the world. What the world would think about India. Now it's very. You can always the best sight is hindsight, so we don't know what would have happened at that time. But I think people like Patel and Shastri were more invested inside the country. They were looking for, their constituency was India. Their entire constituency was Indian. Whereas Mr. Nehru was looking at the global stage. He was looking at the world polity. He was looking at a place in the UN. He wanted to project a certain image of India. Whereas I think both Mr. Patel and Mr. Shastri were more invested in the near, in the immediate. So possibly history would have been different. But as far as the non-marking of Tibet, the removal of Tibet from our maps is concerned, I think this was very, very. This is a mistake in history, which again got rectified only in 58, 59. So we had 3 or 4 maps which did not have Tibet as a reference point. And one more thing I'd like to mention here, that the Britishers never mentioned China as the as the boundary of India. They always used the word Tibet. The Britishers were, I would say, very intelligent cartographers. It took us some time to understand the larger implications of the maps. Perhaps it took us some time because there was so I think we got to acknowledge the fact that it takes time for a country to understand how significant maps are in the overall strategy of the country.
Dr. Chopra, whenever you've written an article on the maps, you've always made us think what would have happened differently. And in a way, you've highlighted the roles maps have played in impacting upon the political consciousness of the country. So, given the question that Gauri asked now, okay, what if not this leader or that leader? So, do you think the maps would have evolved irrespective of the agent being there, the human agent being there, like based on the political circumstances and how our nation was evolving, or did individual really had a salient role in playing an important role? So the individual's nudge in that case become important. Can we see these two as separate, or what there was a dialectic between the two? How do you look at it?
Thank you for this question. You see, we must understand that three or four very important leaders in our country, starting with Dr. Ambedkar, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Sardar Patel, all of them had written on linguistic states in the country. Dr. Ambedkar, for instance, had written thoughts on Pakistan. Then he wrote about, and in fact, Dr. Ambedkar's was one of the most well-researched memoranda to the States Reorganization Commission, where he made out a case for Maharashtra, where he made out a case for a Maratha-speaking region. He didn't really name it Maharashtra, and he said that yes, in fact, when in 1947 or 48, when a delegation of Sikh leaders went to Dr. Ambedkar, when he was still a Union cabinet minister, and said that we want a separate state for the Sikhs, he told them, he said, look, you are not going to get a separate state for the Sikhs, but if you say that you want a linguistic state for Punjabi, I am with you. Right? So you had a rare consensus between four top leaders of the country at that time. And India, I mean, if you take these four leaders, they were actually colossal, thinkers at that time. So on this one issue, there was a consensus between Mahatma Gandhi, between Nehru, between Patel and Ambedkar that yes, there should be the linguistic reorganization state should take place. It is true that in the JVP committee, they said that this is not the time. This is not the time because at that time there was fair amount of we had to get all these princely states integrated. So they wanted some time. But I think right from the very beginning, it was very clear that in order to have a modern democratic polity, one in which political communication plays a very important role, one in which the articulation of interest plays a very important role, it is essential, not just it's imperative that you have to have this thing. So I mean, given this set of leaders, I'm sure India would have been reorganized. What would have happened is that Nagaland was made in 1963. Perhaps it would have been made in 1959. It could have been in 1965. I mean, the linguistic reorganization of Punjab and to Punjabi Suba, it happened in 1966. It could have happened in 1959. It could have been delayed by another 4 years. But this had to happen. So all these agitations, all these movements, they were spurred. And let's also understand that when you look back, you find that it was not such a fractured sort of polity at that time. I mean, Akalis had common membership with the Congress. A lot of these things were there. The Maharashtra movement, they had people from the Communist Party, they had people from the Socialist Party, they had people from the Congress. So there was a lot of churn that was happening in those days. So we do not have to look at the 50s and the 60s in the manner that we look at polity today. Because one of the things that you got to understand is that everybody who was a leader in the 50s was a part of the independence movement of the country. So that's something which had kept them together, which had brought them together. Mm-hmm. And their essential reason to join politics was not power. Their essential reason to join politics was the freedom of this country. So whether you had, I mean, whether it was a communist leader here, or whether it was an RSS worker there, or whether it was a Congress activist somewhere else, or whether it was a socialist, their first thing was that they wanted freedom from the British. And therefore, there was a lot of collaboration that was happening. It is only now that lines, again, like political boundaries in states, we've had a lot of boundaries today, which perhaps did not exist in the 50s when I go back to the literature of those times.
Dr. Chopra, let's go to Karnataka. You mentioned a phrase called linguistic nationalisms. How do you perceive linguistic nationalisms coexisting with the idea of a Rashtra Bhasha?
Well, I think, you see, in fact, if you see the currency note of India, there are so many Rashtra Bhashas that we have, and therefore there is no such problem in having more than one Rashtra Bhasha. See, India has always been a multilingual country, and therefore there is no problem if we have Kannada, and we have Tamil, and we have Telugu, and we have Malayalam, and we have Konkani, and we have Nepali. So many languages that does not really matter. In fact, I use the term linguistic nationalism in the sense of political mobilization. And in fact, let's also remember that this was political mobilization against the British Raj. It was political mobilization against the empire, and that continued because even post-independence, that assertion to come together as a group was there. And I'm referring to Alluri Rao, who was very keen that the linguistic nationalism of Karnataka should be as strong as the linguistic nationalism of Bengal, as the linguistic nationalism of the Marathas, as the linguistic nationalism of the Punjabis. So I don't see a problem in linguistic nationalism contradicting the Indian nationalism. So these are all complementing each other, right? So you have to look at it as a complement. So it's like getting several flowers in a bouquet. One does not really cut out the other, but adds to the beauty of the diverse range that you have. That's how I would like to put it.
However, Dr. Chopra, if you look at Telangana, and you have your whole elaboration has been how different states have come into being on the basis of linguistic nationalism or ethnic identity. But if you look at Telangana, it has largely been not a language issue because Telugu is still the common language. It is not caste, it is not ethnicity. So, in this case, having a separate state, language is just used as maybe a instrument, just to have a political end. It is not as a expressive or a medium of art or an expression, and the whole reason for forming a state becomes a little sinister. Can one say that?
No, I think, first of all, having a political end, there's nothing wrong in having a political end. I mean, it's legitimate to have political ends. It's legitimate to mobilize people on whatever is accepted within the norms of the constitution. So if you can mobilize people on the basis of language, there is nothing wrong about it. There are two factors which have always been there. One is the issue of development, and the second is the issue of a linguistic state. Now, obviously, you have so many linguistic states which have Hindi. You have so many states in which Hindi is the official language, right? So it does not mean that one language. In fact, Dr. Ambedkar was very clear that while he is in favor of linguistic states, it does not mean that one language can have only one state. He was very clear about that. So you can have, so both aspects are there. There's the aspect of development. There's the aspect of perceived neglect. One is that you are, for instance, one of the arguments which, and I was posted in Darjeeling or in Uttarakhand, in terms of indices, the development parameters of Darjeeling have always been better than the development parameters of Murshidabad, for example, or of Midnapur, which are both, heartland states, if you would use the term, for Bengal. But the issue in Darjeeling was not an issue of development. It was an issue of a linguistic assertion. Now, you see, what other aspect is that what you get, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you have achieved a certain thing, then you fight for something else. As long as you're, if language, if you can mobilize people on the basis of language, you will mobilize people on the basis of language. If language is no longer the issue of mobilization, then it could be development. If it is not development, it could be ecology. So it's a very complex relationship between political mobilization, political articulation. I think it's fine. I mean, a nation, a mature nation, must be able to grapple with all assertion. That's why you see the title of my book, as and when it comes out, is Aspirations, Adjustments. Aspirations, assertions, and adjustment. See, every ethnic group, every linguistic group will aspire. It will assert and then it will adjust because it is not possible to accept or to have every adjustment cannot be every aspiration cannot be met. So far we have been able to handle ethnicities and linguistic issues when those who are from a particular ethnicity or have a particular language, they are in a majority in at least certain areas. Now you have issues in Bodoland, for example, or issues of various other places. I mean, things which are in the sixth schedule of the constitution. Now these are areas where you are not in a majority, even in a limited territorial area. So what do you do? So that's why you have to find different sets of solutions to different issues as they will emerge, as they will come up. So your question, I'm sorry, I got carried away, and your question was essentially on Telangana. You see, the development gap between the Telugu-speaking regions in the erstwhile state of Hyderabad and the Madras province was always quite intense. There was always a major difference between these two Telugu-speaking areas. And the State Reorganization Commission had actually recommended that the merger should not happen immediately, and they wanted to give 5 years time, and so that the development dimensions could be passed up. But at that point of time, there was the Vishal movement, and the Vishal movement meant that everybody was, especially the Telugu-speaking regions of the erstwhile Madras presidency, they were very keen that the Hyderabad Telugu area should also be attached. And the agitations for a separate Telangana started in the 60s itself. Within a decade of the United States of all Telugu-speaking people, this agitation had started. So it was on the basis of development that they took the ground. So it's a political contest for sure. When political parties can manage that conflict within themselves or within, it's easier. And when you have regional parties, the dimension is again very different. So if it's a national political party which has its interests in other states also, it's easier for them to sort of balance interests. But if you have a political party which is only confined to one state, then it becomes very difficult for even a national party to sort of compete with them on that particular agenda. And that's what happened in the case of Telugu Desam so you had a Telugu Desam and then you had the TRS, and then the national political parties found that this was such an emotive issue. But once this emotive issue is solved, then again all political parties, national political parties, will again be able to get back to the state scene. Right? For example, now that Punjabi Suba has been made, the Congress and the BJP and all the other parties, they can compete in an equal space with the Akali Dal, because the main issue on which the Akali mobilization had taken place has already been resolved. So, politics is very dynamic. Politics is a very interesting take. So once an issue is resolved, then you move on to the next issue.
Dr. Chopra, you mentioned neglect while answering Mrs. Monika Dhami's question, and that's a pretty value-loaded term. I want to take you back to your mention of the Miller Commission in your articles on Karnataka, and you say that they made provision, they recommended a reservation of 50% for the backward classes decades before we had the Mandal Commission agitations on a similar issue. And you also mentioned Bob Cutling, who was Deputy Commissioner of Mokokchung from 56 to 59. So through your work, you've been bringing to light these hidden and suppressed, often neglected facts. Why do you think facts in history get suppressed? Why do you think they are subdued? And do you think if they had been brought to light at the relevant point in time, they would have been able to impact future events?
There are four questions in this one question, Gauri. Now, let's first move on to the issue of neglect. In fact, the term I used was perceived neglect because you see, what gets neglected, what you perceive as neglect may actually not be neglect, may not be borne out by empirical factors. And how do we measure this neglect is a very difficult question to answer. But it is how that neglect is projected. You see, today you have a very interesting scenario when even advanced states like Punjab say that the center is discriminating against them. In fact, there is not one state in the country which says that the center is not discriminating against that state. I mean, you name one state, perhaps only Lakshadweep Islands might say that, well, we are not being neglected by the government of India. But otherwise, everybody feels the sense of neglect because it's a what is happening is that the aspirations, the development aspirations, are very intense, and there is a limited cake. There's a limited cake. Whatever you might do, that cake will always be limited. So everybody is wanting to get more from that pie, and I don't think there's a problem in that. So if people want to do it, if states want to do it, it's legitimate for them to ask for this. Now, second point was about whether facts are suppressed in history or whether facts are ignored in history or which facts get more highlighted. I think it's also a question of the orientation of the historian. It's a question of what the person who's writing history is looking about. What is the meta narrative that he or she has in mind? You see, my meta narrative in the mapping of Indian states is to give primacy to the regional over the New Delhi, over the center of power. So I'm looking for heroes in the Northeast. I'm looking for heroes in Sikkim. I'm looking for heroes everywhere, other than those who've captured power in Delhi. Now, capturing power is not bad. It's very, very legitimate. But so much has been written already about those who have become, who are prime ministers of this country, or who were governor generals, or who were viceroys, or before them the Sultan and the Mughals and the East India Company. That is an area which does not require, may require scholarship, but I think this is an area which has often been neglected. I mean, how many of us know Nijlinga, for instance? We know very little about Bob Cutting, I just mentioned. I mean, in fact, and of so many other regional heroes, Indulal Yagnik in Gujarat, for example, or and I can go on and on and on and tell you about names who played such an important role in the history of their region and in integrating the region to the country, in fighting for various aspects of the region. And I think it's time that the Indian history narrative is populated by the states of India, because India is a union of states. So as I started the conversation, India, that we the people of India have constituted it. That is one aspect. And second, that India is a union of states. So we need to talk about people who have played a critical role in the states of India and in their formation. And that brings me to Major Bob Cutting. You see, the interesting, or whatever you might say, that most people would know about those who fought against India insofar as the Naga insurgency is concerned, if I could use that term. Everybody knows about Isaac Muiva, they know about Fizo, they know about Kaplang faction. How many of us know who was the first chief minister of Nagaland? How many of us acknowledge and recognize that Sakira was the person who became the first CM of Nagaland, and he had to face a lot of opposition? Right? So in that context, if Bob Cartling had not been the deputy commissioner of Mokokchung at a time when three important conventions were held in Mokokchung, where those who were opposed to the underground Nagas came up and said, we want to be part of India. We don't want, we acknowledge the fact that we are Indians and we want to participate in the democratic process. It's again like the fact that now, of course, we hold the moral lecture, the Srinivasulu, in the state. Otherwise, more people would know about Virappan than they would know about who captured Virappan. Right. So this is one of the tropes of history which I want to change. We have to acknowledge those who played a very significant role. In getting India together, in integrating India. And in that context, I found that Bob Cutting is one hero who should have been. I mean, he's acknowledged, he's been given a Padma Shri, He was our first ambassador to Myanmar. But you know, he's not common currency. Imagine a thankful Naga. And one of the reasons that he's not been recognized is that he was a Naga from, he's a thankful Naga from Manipur, where the state perhaps does not want to acknowledge him because he's not the dominant faction, or he's not, I mean, to put it true, he's not the Jat Sikh of Punjab. You know, he's the ignored person in his territory. And therefore, somebody needs to inform that he had a major contribution to make in integrating that region into India. There was something else also that you asked about the trade.
One last question, Dr. Yes, Gauri?
Okay.
No, it was just that, do you think if at the relevant point in time these facts would have been brought to light, they would have been able to impact future events which were connected to them? Like the Mandal Commission. Do you think the Mandal Commission?
No, certainly. Taking on from Bob Cutting, I think that if Bob Cutting had been if the airport at say in Dimapur was named after Bob Cutting, you know, why not? I mean, why should airports and railway stations and other important markers be named after regional heroes? I mean, that's what's so important. I mean, why should every airport in the country be named after so-called national leaders? We could name airports which are connected, to the people. For instance, I'm glad that the airport in Chandigarh is after Shahid Bhagat Singh. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, the airport in Calcutta is after Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, but we could have had an airport on Bob Cutting, and if we had an airport on Bob Cutting, everybody would have, known that yes, there is somebody called Bob Cutting, and somebody would have researched him. Somebody would have known that he was, a fascinating person. I mean, started out as a teacher, joined the British Army as a Viceroy commissioned officer, came back, became an Indian Frontier Administration Service officer, led a troop of Assam Rifles, got Tawang told the monastery at Tawang that stop paying tribute to Tibet, start paying it to us. I mean, the whole history could have been very different if we had acknowledged these people maybe differently. These are all, interesting things about history that you don't know what would have happened. But it's very important for us to acknowledge all the different people who have made a major contribution in the states, in the formation of states. And then in the formation of states, how these states have made India. That's my take on the meta-narrative of Indian history, if you look at it from the point of view of the states. That's the point that I'm trying to get to.
So, if I can ask one last question, Dr. Chopra, your study of Indian states begins in 1947. And if we are to look at 2047, when India would be 100, and you see two trends across happening now. One is the Hindi becoming a pan-Indian language, partly due to Bollywood, partly due to the economics of migration, where labor is moving across the country from northern states to southern states. So taking the language of Hindi with them, and the vernaculars taking a retreat because there is not enough market for them. Like even in Punjab or Karnataka, the vernaculars, or in Andhra, the new generation might not be taking to vernaculars in that fashion. So do you see I would say, the nemesis of states on linguistic nationalism and emergence of a much more amorphous identity of being India, and the whole idea of states, which was originally envisaged as linguistically diverse states, losing their meaning?
It's a very, very important question, Monika, and I think that there will certainly be a reorganization of states again, but that would emanate from the asymmetry amongst the existing states. You have states like UP, and you have states like Nagaland, and you have states like Sikkim, and you have states like Madhya Pradesh, you have Rajasthan, and then you have Sikkim, or you have very, very small states. So it is this asymmetry which will be called into question sooner or later. That is one factor. To my mind, that will be the most important factor in the reorganization of states. Second factor would be that somehow these states which are smaller in size seem to be growing much faster. I mean, the growth parameters of Uttarakhand, for example, or the growth parameters of Sikkim, for example, or the growth parameters of Goa, for example. So they seem to be doing much better than larger states in terms of normal indices that we see around us. So the quest for new states will be driven by the development agenda and by the agenda of equity rather than the agenda of language alone. Because as I mentioned earlier, when a particular issue has been resolved, it ceases to be an important factor. I mean, till such time as you have a good air-conditioned office, you aspire for it. But once you have an air-conditioned office, that is past, then you are looking for other things. So I think that is again what will happen in the case of India. That Punjab is fine, Karnataka is fine, and I think with the new education policy, there will be another resurgence of our vernacular languages. It is going to happen. You see, the political representation from those who speak the languages that will continue to grow and grow. Another factor that will happen is that the larger cities, I mean, the way they are shaped, that will again play a very important role because urbanization is going to happen. When urbanization happens, then these large urban conglomerations, they will certainly be multilingual and multi-ethnic. For instance, in fact, Calcutta is no longer a typically Bengali city. Bangalore is no longer a typically Kannada city. Delhi is no longer a Punjabi city. So all this is bound to happen. So once that happens, you will find another churn in the politics of the country, where there will be states, where there will be very large cities, which will not be driven on the domain of language, alone. So it's going to be a very interesting churn. Let's see how it pans out. Historians should never try to guess what the future is. It's better that we confine ourselves to the past. We go through the old records and come out with why things happened rather than predict things in the long run. But some broad trends I've tried to share with you. But certainly, you see the internal maps of this country, the internal reorganization of the boundary. If it happens, it's perfectly fine. I'm quite comfortable with the internal changes in the boundary of the country. I think it strengthens the country.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra, and it was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you, Ms. Gauri Joshi, for raising such pertinent issues. And it was nice listening to the whole history of Indian states through the MAPS project. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure interacting. Thank you. Bye. Okay, thank you very much. We've had a very nice session. Thank you, Monika, for all the questions. Now we have 3 questions on our chat box so far, and if we get more questions, we'll try to respond to those as well. The first question that we have right now with me is that it's on the COVID pandemic, and that's the question which has come on the chat box, and the question is very relevant today, especially as not only Delhi but even Missouri is we are all under the impact of COVID. So it says, do you think that COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the importance of governance by states and their importance rather than the center? And connected to this is the fact that why are the lists in the 7th schedule to the constitution as well as the taxation structure skewed towards the central government? I think that Monika will respond to the second part of this question about why the taxation structure is skewed in favor of the center. But let me respond to the first issue. You see that when you have an issue like the pandemic, it is not a question of center versus the state. It's not a question of governance by the state and the relative importance of the center of the state. You see, as far as the disaster management regime in the country is concerned, it is covered under the National Disaster Management Act, in which there are clear responsibilities given to both the center and the state. I think it's the pandemics actually help the country to come together. Pandemics actually help, not just the pandemic, but all crises help a nation to come together, and that is what we've seen. But for the very good coordination amongst the state governments and the railways and the airlines and also all the arms of the government, we would not have been able to handle the pandemic the way we've handled it in our country. Look, you cannot avoid the pandemic. It is there. But what we can do is we can mitigate the impact of this virus. This virus will be there, but how we react to the virus, whether our systems and institutions break down, as they've happened in some parts of the world, or whether the institutions become stronger. And I personally feel, having seen the response of the district administration, the response of the hospitals, the response of the janitors, the response of everybody. I think it has just brought the country together. It's brought the country together. But to respond to the second part of your question, which is about taxation structures being skewed in favor of the government of India. So over to you, Monika, for that.
Yeah, I would say there is a tilt towards the center, but I wouldn't say it's highly skewed because over time the federal structure has evolved. If you look at the taxation per se, the indirect taxes and direct taxes are now almost equally poised around 50%. So direct taxes is something which only the central government can collect. The state governments cannot collect. So by virtue of that, the central government kitty becomes larger. The indirect taxes, yes, are now shared with the new GST regime is very fair, and the whole GST in fact took time to come because each and every state was onboarded, and the whole, if you look at the slip also which you are given, it says central GST, state GST, so it's almost there is a fair play there. And I would say the center has been also considerate, like whenever there is a particular calamity in a state, they sort of give special emoluments then to the state, and special monetary assistance is given. And if you look at any structure, like even if you look at US or any structure, the fiscal balance is will always have a tilt towards the center, because that's what the center is for. It can decide in a fair manner which states need more resources. So there are states like UP and the northern states which sometimes need more resources, and the states which are doing themselves economically well are able to raise resources. So in that sense, I wouldn't say it's skewed, but yes, there is a tilt, and which actually helps strengthen your federal structure, because it leads to a much fairer system and distribution later on.
Thank you. I think it's a very good response. Now there are two more questions, of which I will take one, and I'll request Gauri to take the next one. So I'll first announce the question which Gauri has to take so that she can be prepared for it, while I respond to the simpler question, because I've just written on Tamil Nadu last week, so I'm well aware of this question. So the question which I would want Gauri to respond to is that what should be the intellectual criterion of ideal mapping of statehood in the country, keeping in mind the holistic view of the economy and an opportunity-based matrix. And how do we go about it? That's the question which I would want you to respond to. The question that I am going to respond to, being the chair of this, because I'm here at the virtual venue, is the question on why English is used as a link language more than Hindi in the southern states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. Now, let me respond to this question, because I have dealt with this in my recent article. See, at the time of independence in 1950, there was a 15-year period that had been given for English to continue as the official language of the country. And then the transition had to take place to Hindi. But as was mentioned in the earlier discussion, the linguistic assertion was very important. And therefore, Tamil Nadu, especially Tamil Nadu, felt that the imposition of Hindi is going against their Dravidian identity. See, what had happened was that in 1962, Mr. C. Annadurai had been giving speeches in the Rajya Sabha saying that privates want a separate state, and the entire movement of the Justice Party and then DK was for a separate Dravidistan at that point of time. But because of the linguistic reorganization of states, this movement died down. So the new agenda for mobilizing people in Tamil Nadu was the opposition to Hindi. And Annadurai came out with a lovely, I would say very bright slogan when he said, "Down with Hindi, long live the Republic." He said that he was not willing to accept the imposition of Hindi, that he is willing to accept the Indian nationhood as such. That was a very important change from the earlier stand that they had taken. And I think that is because under the 16th constitutional amendment, the oath had now to be taken that you accept the integrity and the unity of the state. That India's integrity cannot be called to question. So this happened, and therefore, and there was a major agitation at that point of time. So it was conceded that let English continue to be the associate language for all times to come, till the time as any state wishes to continue to work in English. The Government of India accepted that. And then what has happened is that I think that the opposition to Hindi is most pronounced in Tamil Nadu. But for purposes of convenience now, not just in the southern states, but even in states like Bengal, Punjab, Assam, the whole of Northeast, English is used as a language of governance, it's used as a language for communication, and it has actually become a little bit of a non-issue now, because the country has evolved to a level where the assertion of identity is not just based on language, there are many ways to assert identity. So that's a brief answer to a very, very complex issue. And over to you, Gauri, Professor Joshi, for your response to what should be the ideal criterion for making a new state.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. I think that's an interesting question, and from time to time when states are formed, this question is gone into, and I think administrative efficiency becomes one of the reasons. What is administratively governable? And that is why states that are very large have over time been broken down into smaller units, perhaps so that the connect between the state and the citizen, who is also an integral part of the state, becomes firmer. I do think that perhaps a cultural connect could also be one possible intellectual criterion for mapping states, because there are portions of states that are connected to each other by language, by culture. And there is in various states, for example, in East India, there is a demand for making, say, Orissa, the western part of Orissa, west and southwest Orissa, into a separate region called Kaushal, because they're more connected by language, they're more connected by culture. There is a predominance of tribal culture in some of the districts in western and southwestern Orissa. However, the question does come into play that this kind of cultural connect is also amenable to political intervention. So whether it is the cultural connect that can be an intellectual criterion, absolutely separate from any kind of political intervention, is a moot question, I would say.
Right. So I think this is a very good response to the very good response, that we need to understand not just the administrative aspects of it, we also need to understand the cultural aspects of it. We need to understand the political dimension of all this. And one of the things which is always there is that, once you start accepting a criterion for the making of the state, then you have to accept that criterion for all times to come. It's happened in 1963 when Nagaland was made. So when Nagaland was made, it was a clear, acceptance of the principle that you can be made into a state if there is an ethnic demand for the state. And Nagaland was certainly not viable economically at that time, and many states in the Northeast are still not economically viable. And so economic viability is just one of the many criterion, and not the sole criterion in a democratic polity. So these are some very interesting things, and all this leads to a large number of movements. What is most important for all of us to realize is that while the territorial integrity of India is sacrosanct, and that's what Article 1, 2, and 3 also make it very clear, as far as the internal reorganization within the country is concerned, if aspirations, whether linguistic or ethnic, administrative or developmental, are concerned, it is part of the democratic process, and therefore it's something that we can cherish, something that we can welcome, and something that we move on with. So, although the conversation was started by Monika, let me thank both Ms. Dhami and my colleague Dr. Joshi, not yet a doctor, but she's a PhD scholar. So in a few years' time, she'll certainly be Dr. Joshi. So thank you very much to my colleagues, and thank you very much to all those who have joined our session today. And do send in your questions, and we will try to respond to your questions as soon as we can. Thank you very much. It has been indeed a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.